Welcome to Rethinking Europe, the podcast series of the European Integration Association, where we critically examine Europe's political, legal, and strategic future beyond orthodoxies and easy answers. I'm Aybars Öztürk, Global Partnerships and Fundraising Lead at the European Integration Group, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Seyide Direk, a leading voice at the intersection of EU law, sustainability, and social innovation. Seyide holds a Master of Laws in Law and Sustainable Development from the University of Milan, as well master's degree in European and Global Studies from the University of Padova, an academic trajectory that uniquely positions her to interrogate Europe's regulatory ambitions alongside its global responsibilities. She currently serves as the founder and president of the European Center for Social Innovation, where she works on rethinking policy-driven solutions to Europe's structural social challenges. And as a regulatory lead at Challenger Research, contributing strategic insights on EU governance, sustainability frameworks, and economic transformation. In today's episode, we will be moving beyond surface level policy debates to unpack the deeper legal, normative, and geopolitical questions shaping Europe's future. Seyide, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to Rethinking Europe.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
The EU has long framed itself as a normative power, yet the post-2022 security environment has pushed it towards strategic autonomy. Is the EU experiencing a paradigmatic shift away from norm diffusion toward interest-based legal pragmatism, or are we witnessing a sophisticated recalibration of normativity under systemic pressure?
I will describe the current phase as more like a recalibration, not an abandonment. So the EU still grounds its legitimacy in norms, rule of law, proportionality, and fundamental rights, of course. The foundations remain intact. So what changed after 2022 involves operating environments. So like the security shocks, the supply chain fragility, the energy disruption, the geopolitical rivalry, and the policymaking now pretty much integrates resilience, risk reduction, and the strategic capacity alongside with the traditional market integration goals. So you see this in several areas. So first, industrial economic security policy. So in these instruments such as the European Chips Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and the FDI screening frameworks pretty much reflects defensive regulatory logic. So the objective is not ideological protectionism, but rather it's the continuity of the production, technological sovereignty, and the reduced dependency on the single suppliers. The second will be the semiconductor supply chains. So before 2022, efficiency dominated. So there were lower costs, there were global resourcing, but now policy pretty much weighs redundancy. It depends on the trusted partners, and of course, the domestic capacity. So the legal tools support risk diversification rather than the pool liberalization. We also need to look at it from energy perspective. So the energy law pretty much moved from the climate transition towards security of the supply transition. One of the most important topics right now will be the defense. So defense procurement, export controls, and the research funding pretty much shows similar evaluation. We can take the example of the European Defense Fund. So it was originally framed around the cooperation and efficiency, but now it's framed more in the capability gaps, interoperability, and of course, strategic autonomy. So what matters is now the mechanism. Norms increasingly operate through a resilience lens. Earlier, EU integration logic asked, how do we deepen openness? But current logic pretty much frames the question as, how do we keep openness sustainable under systematic risks? So this is not really like a paradigmatic rupture, that's rather a shift in the priorities. Normativity itself is just becoming more strategic. So the EU historically exported rules through enlargement, trade agreements, and today it still kind of does, but with added conditions. So you need to have like security safeguards, you need to have reciprocity, you have anti-coercion instruments. So as someone working between policy, regulation, and research, I find this evolution pretty much reasonable because Europe faces simultaneous pressures. There's like internal cohesion challenges, there are external security threats, there's also technological competition, there's a global competition. So pretty much a rigid normative posture detached from material realities will weaken the credibility. So a purely interest-driven posture detached from values will also weaken the identity. So at the same time, EU is trying to balance both. So the tension, I will say, is real. The trade-offs are visible. So the debates intensify around the state aid, the fiscal flexibility, and the defense spending. But the core architecture remains pretty much anchored. So if to be like more precise, the EU is embedding its normative model within a geopolitical risk management framework. So it's not less normative, it's rather more conditional, more security aware, and it's also, of course, more resilient. I will say this distinction is important.
EU sustainability policy increasingly migrates from soft law into binding regulatory frameworks like taxonomies, CSRD, and CBAM. At what point does sustainable development cease to be a policy objective and become a justiciable constitutional principle of the EU legal order? And are member states prepared for that transition?
In legal terms, sustainable development already sits close to the constitutional status, right? So the Article 3OT of the Treaty of the European Union explicitly commits the Union to sustainable development. Article 11 and Article 191 of the Treaty of the Function of the European Union embed environmental integration and precaution. So the Charter, the secondary legislation, and the Court of Justice, it reinforced this trajectory. So the shift we absorb now is operational. Soft commitments moving into binding and more enforceable obligation. If you look at it from the taxonomy, the CSRD and the CBAM, there's like the matter is important because first of all, it's a policy objective guides legislation, and it also as a constitutional principle constraints that is that is related to legislation and the state action. So once sustainability norms generate, there is a direct obligation, there is enforceable rights and duties, judicial review standards, and of course, courts treat them as legal benchmarks, not as political aspiration. We are approaching that threshold today. For example, with the EU taxonomy regulation, it was originally framed as a classification system, but in practice, it influences the investment flows, the disclosure duties, risk assessments. The financial actors now face litigation exposure, greenwashing, misclassification, misleading ESG claims. And then when does this shift become a constitutional in practice? So the three signals indicate consolidation into constitutional principle. The first of all, it's the judicial enforceability expense. So the courts increasingly review EU and national measures against sustainable anchored standards, proportionality, environmental integration, and intergenerational equality in equity arguments. Secondly, that's the cross-sectoral application. It pretty much stabilizes. So sustainability obligation influence competition law, state aid, financial regulation, procurement, trade, and corporate governance. And lastly, it's the policy discretion narrows. So the legislators retain flexibility, but cannot ignore sustainability constraints without legal justification. We already see early forms of this. So with regards to this, are member states really prepared? Preparation varies, it varies significantly because it creates challenges for member states. For example, there's administrative capacity gaps between the states. There's also fragmented enforcement structures. And there's a big tension with the industrial policy priorities. So I see two parallel realities in that case. So that at EU level, sustainability evolves into systematic governance architecture. Rather at the national level, the implementation capacity and the political readiness remain uneven. And the risk is not really legal overreach. The risk is pretty much asymmetric adaptation.
Between trade, climate policy, migration compacts, and security cooperation, EU external action is governed by overlapping legal bases. Has the EU's external action framework reached a point of functional fragmentation that undermines coherence, and should we be speaking of a de facto pluralization of EU foreign policy law?
Fragmentation does exist, but I wouldn't call it like a dysfunction. I would call it a structural complexity under pressure. EU external action was never built as a single unified foreign policy system. It pretty much developed through layers. Like it combined the foreign common foreign and security policy, trade policy, development cooperation, neighborhood policy, migration, and of course, like each of them rests on a different treaty provisions, voting rules, institutional roles, and the judicial oversight mechanism. So for years, this multi-based design worked because priorities pretty much aligned. Economic integration dominated, external policy followed a market logic, so consensus proved easier. And geopolitical environment changed faster than the legal architecture. So now the EU conducts external action across domains that pull in different directions. So we have trade openness and economic security. We have migration management versus fundamental rights. The legal basis did not really fragment it. The policy objectives, it pretty much diversified. The distinction matters because what looks like fragmentation often reflects competing rationalities embedded in the EU law. So if you look at it from the trade policy, climate policy, migration compacts, when all of these areas interact, tension naturally surface. Not because the framework failed, but because the union now operates simultaneously as a market regulator, as a climate actor, a security actor, a border manager. So no classical international organization carries such a hybrid mandate. Is coherence undermined in this case? It becomes harder, but it's not really absent because the treaties already require consistency across external policy. So the challenge lies in execution. Different decision rules pretty much produce asymmetry. From the outside, the partners sometimes struggle to read the EU's position. From the inside, coordination costs pretty increase. Yet, polarization also brings advantages. So a single rigid foreign policy doctrine would limit flexibility. The EU's strength often lies in deploying various instruments, such as the market access, financial assistance, partnership frameworks. And the deeper shift is that rather earlier, the thought was, how do you project the stability? But currently, the question is, how do we manage risks, rivalry, and the resilience? So that shift naturally stresses legal boundaries. So we see more hybrid instruments. Should we speak of a pluralized foreign policy law? So I will say yes, descriptively.
From ESG regulation to digital and AI governance, EU policymaking is increasingly export-driven. How sustainable is the EU's legitimacy model when democratic accountability lags behind technocratic complexity? And does this risk entrenching a post-democratic governance structure?
The legitimacy model holds, but it runs closer to its capacity limits. EU governance relies on a chain. So the Commission proposes, the Parliament and Council legislate, Member States enforce, and the Court review, transparency rules and impact assessments support the cycle. And of course, expert input belongs in every step. So the strain comes from a scale and a speed. So ESG, digital, AI files create compliance systems that only specialists fully read. So when policy becomes unreadable to non-specialists, democratic contestation weakens. So people debate slogans, not provisions, which creates two risks. The first one will be the interest groups with technical capacity dominate the agenda setting. And the second, political actors outsource the decisions because sovereignty costs exceed time and the staff. So the combination can look a bit post-democratic, even if a formal democracy still functions. For example, with some concrete examples, the AI Act style governance. So the core obligation depend on the technical standards, conformity assessment, and the post-market monitoring. The legal text set the frame. The operational meaning often comes later through harmonized standards, delegated acts, guidance, and of course, a supervisory practice. So if you ask a small company what to do, the answer is rarely in one article. The answer sits in a network of annexes, standards, and the future interpretive documents. So now the question is the model sustainable? I will say yes, if three conditions hold. So first of all, we need to have political ownership of trade-offs. So elected actors must openly own the trade-off choices, not hide behind experts. So when policy balances safety and innovation, the lawmakers need to defend where they set the thresholds, bans, and exemptions. And they need also, secondly, a better ex-ante accountability. Scrutiny must move the upstream. For example, it has to have concrete steps such as the mandatory publication of the drafts for key guidance and standards, clear registers of expert group membership in conflicts, stronger resourcing, and lastly, better ex post accountability. So enforcement bodies must be auditable. If these fail, you get a durable legitimacy problem, not really a legal crisis, but a democratic attention crisis. Where you see it is that the agenda shaping shifts to a technical communities and a large compliance capable actors. For me, the core test is simple. Can a well-informed and non-specialist journalist, a civil society, or an SME representative follow how a rule becomes constrained and contents in time? If the answer becomes no, the legitimacy pretty much erodes, even if the treaties stay the same.
The EU's Green Deal industrial plan reintroduces state aid flexibility and industry targeting. Is the EU quietly abandoning its internal market orthodoxy? And if so, how does it prevent sustainability-driven protectionism from hollowing out competition law?
I wouldn't describe the Green Deal as an abandonment of the internal market orthodoxy. I will describe it as like a conditional flexibility under strategic pressure. Because the EU pretty much faced three simultaneous constraints. So there's like decarbonization timelines, there's a global subsidy races, there's also industrial competitiveness. Strict state control designated for a stability phase, which is struggles in a transition phase that requires more rapid investments. So the Commission widened the corridor. It didn't really remove the guardrails. So the state aid rules still apply. So compatibility assessment still exists, proportionality, necessity, and the limited duration still matters. So the temporary crisis and the transition framework illustrates this logic. So faster approvals, targeted objectives, sunset clauses. The real tension sits rather elsewhere. So how do you support green industries without distorting competition or fragmenting the single market? There are two risks that require constant management. The first one is a subsidy asymmetry. So the wealthier member state possess a greater fiscal capacity. The results we see is that some firms that are based in some member states access larger national support, and smaller economies struggle to match. And the second risk will be the grain labeled protectionism. So it's industrial support framed as sustainability policy. The danger is that shielding national champions, reducing market entry, and weakening the competitive discipline. So the competition law prevents this through a strong structure. So the aid must remain targeted. It has to be technology neutral where possible. It has to be linked to a measurable objective. It has to be time limited. So you also see a stricter scrutiny for measures that resemble operating subsidies rather than the transition support. If it's too rigid, there's like the industrialization risk. If it's too permissive, subsidy races inside Europe. Competition policy is not really like weakening. The competition policy is adapting to climate security and, of course, the technological realities.
Rule of law conditionally has evolved from an internal safeguard to an external signal. Does the instrumentalization of rule of law conditionality strengthen EU values globally, or does it risk reducing them to negotiable assets within geopolitical bargaining?
Rule of law conditionality now operates in two stages at once. So internally, it protects the union's legal order and budget. Externally, it communicates what partnership with the EU requires. So this dual function creates both leverage and vulnerability. So on the increasing side, the conditionality ties values the material consequences. So access to EU funds, market privileges, or cooperation frameworks increasingly depend on judicial independence, anti-corruption safeguards, and institutional reliability. So this linkage turns abstract principles into an enforceable expectations. So we saw this logic actually inside the union with budgetary conditionality debate. So this message was clear. So the financial solidarity presumes legal predictability. Externally, similar dynamics appear in enlargement policy and neighborhood relationships. So Candidate countries understand that these progress reports, funding flows, and negotiation chapters hinge on government's benchmarks, not diplomatic goodwill alone. So this pretty much improves the credibility when applied in a consistent manner. But the risk emerges when conditionality looks selective or transactional. If third countries perceive rule of law language as flexible depending on strategic interests, values start to resemble bargaining chips rather than commitments. For example, migration cooperation or security partnerships sometimes advance despite visible governance concerns. So even when justified by an urgent policy need, the optics still matter. Partners, civil society actors, or domestic audiences notice the asymmetry. So the challenge is not really conditionality itself, the challenge is the coherence. So values lose the values lose the force when the political urgency overrides the legal standards without explanation. And on the other hand, they do gain force when the criteria remain stable, assessments rely on clear indicators, and decisions include explicit legal justification. And there is also a practical dimension often ignored. So law conditionality is not an only ethical signal, it's a risk management. So big courts, corruption, and regulatory arbitraries, they undermine the investment security, contract enforcement, and EU financial interests. So the conditionality also protects economic and institutional stability. So from my perspective, working in the regulatory landscape and EU policy, the most sustainable path is disciplined application with honest communication. So it's not a quiet compromise, it's clear standards, it's clear explanation. This approach may be able to prevent values from drifting a rhetoric or a negotiation currency while preserving the EU strategic flexibility.
EU instruments like CBAM and supply chain due diligence export EU standards beyond its borders. How does the EU reconcile claims of global justice with accusations of green and regulatory imperialism, particularly from the global south?
This topic sits at the corner of the current external economic policy. So from Brussels' perspective, the instruments such as the CBAM and supply chain due diligence pretty much address real problems. So we have carbon leakage, environmental damage, labor exploitation, uneven regulatory standards. So the EU argues that climate transition and responsible production require rules that reflect true social and environmental costs. But from many global south perspectives, the same instruments raise different concerns, which might be compliance, administrative, or perhaps market access. And both readings pretty much contain valid elements. So CBAM, for example, aims to equalize carbon costs between EU producers and foreign competitors. Without such mechanism, emission-intensive production simply relocates. And it might undermine climate objectives and penalizes firms operating under stricter EU regulation. Yet exporters in developing economies often face structural disadvantages, which might be limited to emission management system, verification, and of course the green technology. For a steer or cement producer outside of the EU, compliance is not only technical, it's financial, it's also institutional. So how does the EU reconcile justice claims with imperialism techniques? So the credibility depends on the flanking measures. So you have transitional support, you have financial alignment, you have regulatory dialogue, you have proportionality and sequencing. There is also a strategic reality. So the EU cannot push deep internal decarbonization while ignoring external competitiveness effects. The domestic political support for the climate policy partially rests on fairness perceptions. But fairness must work in both directions. If global south partners associate EU sustainability policy with restricted development space, diplomatic friction intensifies. In practice, the EU narrative shifts from exporting standards to managing shared transition risks. The long-term success of these policies will not be judged only by the emission reduction, but by whether partners experience adaptation, upgrading, or inclusion rather than marginalization.
From COVID-19 to energy security and migration, the EU increasingly governs through crisis mechanisms. As emergency governance become normalized within EU law, and what are the long-term constitutional risks of a union operating in a state of permanent exception?
A pattern has emerged. Crisis instruments, once framed as temporary, now appear as a recurring mode of governance. During COVID-19, the Union realized the Article 122 of the Treaty of the Function of the EU, joint procurement, stated flexibility, and the Recovery and the Resilience Facility. Pretty much these tools expand fiscal coordination and the executive discretion. Fifth sunset clauses limited exposed rollback. With energy security, we saw the similar dynamics. So Repower EU, the emergency interventions in the electricity markets, the permitting, and again, urgency justified derogation from standard legislative tempo. So the issue is not really like the emergency governance itself. The treaties, they do anticipate the shocks. The concern lies in the normalization. The repeated reliance shifts expectations have display these dynamics. So the exceptional pathways start to compete with the ordinary lawmaking. From my point, I do see three constitutional risks. The first, institutional balance. So the emergency measures threaten the executive, the commission, and the council, and the speed compresses. So the trilogues under time pressure reduce the depth. And secondly is the legal certainty. Temporary derogations accumulate. So overlapping frameworks create interpretive ambiguity for the actors. So businesses face compliance volatility, and the citizens face unclear rights boundaries. And lastly, it also brings the democratic legitimacy. So citizens accept the extraordinary powers during visible crisis. There is also a path of the dependency problem. So the instruments designed for emergencies, once operational, become politically costly, dismantled. And financial facilities, regulatory flexibilities, coordination platforms develop constituencies. So what helps to mitigate these risks, we need a bit more clear temporal limits. We need a bit more stronger anchoring. And of course, judicial review that tests proportionality and necessity over time, not only at adoption. So a union facing real crisis needs a bit of flexibility as well. A union governed permanently through exception risks, redefining its constitutional identity that explicit treaty change. This is a tension of the polity. This is a subject that the policymakers needs to manage.
EU-Turkey relations are effectively post-accession, but not post-integration. Should the EU conceptualize Turkey through a new category of differentiated integration, or does this ambiguity strategically benefit the Union by preserving leverage without commitment?
The EU-Turkey relations sit in an unusual space right now. So the accession talks remain formally open and the political reality moved pretty much elsewhere. So integration exists in fragments: custom union, the migration cooperation, security dialogue, the sectoral alignment. So the core question becomes a bit conceptual. So does the union define a new framework or maintain a constructive ambiguity? A differentiated integration model will offer more clarity in the specific case. So Turkey already participates selectively. So the customs union, some of the approximation of the trade-related topics, and the coordination in migration through the EU-Turkey statement, cooperation, of course, in NATO, and formalizing this into a structured tier could produce some values and gains for both sides. So first of all, it brings a bit more legal coherence, so rights and obligations become predictable. Fewer ad hoc bargains, lower interpretive tensions between political declarations and the legal framework. And of course, we also need a policy efficiency, the sectoral integration, energy, digital transport, you name it. It could follow a defined accession like pathways without really a full membership conditionality. And the third is the credibility. So the both sides operate under transparent expectation, reduce friction from a symbolic enlargement fatigue. So there, on the other hand, there are also like trade-offs. So the new category risks signaling closure of the membership perspective. So it eventually affects a reform incentives inside Turkey. It also reshapes the union's enlargement narrative towards other candidates. Ambiguity, by contrast, preserves the leverage. So the conditionality remains elastic. The Union adjusts the engagement based on the rule of law, foreign policy alignment, and regional stability. So no need for treaty, no need for a treaty level of innovation. So and ambiguity also reduces internal policy conflicts. Member states hold divergent views on Turkey. Strategic vagueness functions as a political buffer. Yet ambiguity carries costs, so the chronic uncertainty weakens a long-term planning. So the businesses face a regulatory unpredictability, political mistrust. Cooperation becomes a bit transactional rather than structural. So if stability, economic integration, and functional cooperation lead, a differentiated integration framework makes more sense. So if influence through conditionality remains primary, ambiguity continues to serve a purpose. So right now, the EU operates with a hybrid logic, a de facto differentiation. And there's a mismatch, which explains the recruiting topics, the recruiting engagements. So the long-term challenge is the consistency. So the Union, which is advocating rules-based order benefits from frameworks that reflects reality rather than the sustained semantic compromise.
Turkey is simultaneously a security partner, migration buffer, and normative problem for the EU. To what extent does the EU's selective application of conditionality toward Turkey reveal a deeper tension between values-based foreign policy and geopolitical necessity?
The EU's approach to Turkey exposes a structural tension at the heart of its external action. So on paper, conditionality anchors EU foreign policy, rule of law, and fundamental rights, of course. And these principles do shape the enlargement and the neighborhood frameworks. In practice, engagement with Turkey often follows a strategic necessity because Turkey plays a really important role. And especially the most three important roles Turkey plays that Union cannot literally ignore. The first one will be the security. Turkey is a NATO ally, so it's a regional actor in the Black Sea, in the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Counterterrorism and defense coordination matter for European stability. The secondly, it's the migration management. So the EU-Turkey statement reduced irregular crossing in the Aegean. The financial support mechanism followed after. So the cooperation became operationally central for several member states. The third is the economic interdependence. The custom union integrates Turkey deeply into EU value chains. So the trade volumes remain significant for both sides. And because of these interests, conditionality operates a bit uneven. So periods of democratic backsliding triggered criticism and freezes in certain negotiation chapters. At the same time, cooperation intensified migration funding, energy transition, and the security dialogue. So this selectivity signals two realities. The first one, the values and the interests are not applied symmetrically across policy domains. Normative pressure increases in political messaging, and flexibility increases where operational dependence is high. And secondly, the credibility risks. There are a lot of credibility risks. So partners observe inconsistencies between the rhetoric and the behavior. So the domestic audience inside the EU questions whether principles yield to the expediency. So the Turkish policymakers interpret shift as politicized rather than the rule-bound. So the full strategic accommodation weakens normative identity. Neither extreme serves in the long-term stability. So the deeper issue is not really the coming from the two sides. It's governance under the competing imperatives. So the Union acts simultaneously as a normative project and a geopolitical actor, and Turkey sits precisely at the intersection where these logic collide. And managing this tension requires transparency and differentiation. So you need clear separation between normative benchmarks and the functional cooperation tracks. You need explicit criteria for when strategic cooperation proceeds despite political divergence. So without these clarities, the policy appears reactive. So with clarity, the EU preserves both strategic capacity and the normative credibility. So the Turkey doesn't really create this tension, but at the same time, it makes, tension really, really visible.
Seyide, thank you very much for your time and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for having me. It was a really fruitful discussion.